Snow had been falling over Aspen for 11 days straight, and inside the Sterling estate, no one dared to speak above a whisper. The mansion sat high on the ridge, like something carved from ice itself, its windows glowing faintly against the gray mountain sky, and behind those windows lived a woman that 39 caregivers had already fled from in less than 2 years. Vivian Sterling, once the most celebrated biotech executive on the eastern seaboard, had not left her private wing in months. Her wheelchair, custom-built from titanium and carbon fiber, sat parked by the frost-covered window each morning, facing a view she rarely seemed to see. The staff spoke of her the way people speak of a storm that has already destroyed one town and might destroy another. Then Ethan Calloway walked through the front doors carrying nothing but a single leather bag, and Margaret Collins, the head housekeeper who had buried 3 husbands and outlasted every assistant Vivian ever hired, looked him over and told him plainly that he would not survive 1 week. Ethan only smiled, the kind of smile that held no defiance and no fear. Margaret had seen that same calm in exactly one other person in her 65 years, and it had unsettled her then too. She led him down the East Corridor, past portraits of a family that no longer gathered for holidays, past a trophy case honoring achievements that meant nothing to the woman who now lived like a ghost in her own home. The house itself seemed to hold its breath. Even the fireplaces, though lit, gave off a strange kind of cold, as if warmth itself had learned to be careful inside these walls. Margaret warned him a second time, this time softer, almost like a confession, that 42 people had already tried and failed, that Vivian did not need help. She needed someone to disappear. Ethan set his bag down in the small guest room assigned to him and looked out at the mountains, white and endless, folding into a sky the color of unpolished steel. He had spent years working with patients no one else wanted to take, men and women broken by accidents and bad luck and cruel timing, and in every one of them he had learned to look past the anger sitting on the surface. Anger when rarely the real story. It was armor, built fast and built strong, worn by people who had lost something they could never get back. He unpacked slowly, methodically, the way an engineer unpacks a toolkit before a difficult repair, because that was exactly how he thought of his work now, though the machine he had come to fix breathed and bled and remembered. Before coming to Aspen, Ethan had spent nearly a decade in aerospace engineering, designing systems meant to keep aircraft steady through conditions that would break lesser machines, and though he had left that career behind after his wife passed, the discipline of it never left him. He had learned in those years that every failure had a cause, that nothing broke without reason, and that patience, applied correctly, could coax function out of almost anything that still had a working part left inside it. It was this same philosophy that had carried him into caregiving work. First with veterans returning from injuries that reshaped their entire lives. Then, with patients like Vivian, people the rest of the world had quietly given up, trying to understand. He did not see broken things. He saw things waiting to be understood correctly for the first time. The estate itself told its own story to anyone patient enough to notice. Photographs from years earlier still hung along the main staircase, images of galas and press conferences, of Vivian Sterling shaking hands with senators and scientists, always upright, always in motion, a woman who had built an empire through sheer force of will. Those photographs had not been taken down, though no one in the house looked at them anymore, and Ethan found it telling that the version of Vivian preserved on those walls felt like a stranger to the version now living behind a closed door on the second floor. He wondered, that first week, how long it had been since anyone in the house had spoken to her, as though she were still that same woman rather than the wreckage the accident had supposedly left behind. That evening, Dr. Leonard Hayes stopped him in the hallway outside Vivian's suite, his expression somewhere between pity and warning. He explained, in the clipped tone of a man who had delivered this speech too many times, that Vivian Sterling had been paralyzed from the waist down after a helicopter crash 2 years earlier, that she had once run one of the largest biotech holdings in the country from a boardroom on the 40th floor, and that the woman behind that door now was not the woman the world remembered from magazine covers. He said it as a kindness, the way one might warn a swimmer about a current. But Ethan only nodded and thanked him, because he had already decided that nothing anyone said about her would matter until he saw her for himself. When he finally knocked and entered her room the following morning, Vivian did not turn from the window. Her voice, when it came, was flat and precise, carved from years of boardrooms and hostile takeovers, and she told him without looking that she gave her staff exactly 3 days before she found a reason to remove them. Ethan set down his bag, walked past her without asking permission, and began quietly examining the brakes on her wheelchair. The ones that had been squeaking, he suspected, for weeks. Vivian finally turned her head, startled less by his silence than by the fact that he had not asked her a single question about her condition, her feelings, or her pain. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had simply walked into her world and started fixing something instead of asking her to talk about it. The days that followed built a rhythm no one in the house had seen before. Ethan did not ask about her past. He did not offer sympathy she had not requested, and he never once used the tone people used when they were trying too hard to be gentle with something fragile. Instead, he repaired the squeaking left wheel on her chair, tightened the loose handrail along the corridor that Margaret had complained about for a year, recalibrated the temperamental heating system that kept the east wing 5 degrees colder than the rest of the house, adjusted the swinging door to her private study so it no longer stuck against the frame, and quietly replaced the ancient coffee machine in the kitchen that had been burning every pot of coffee it made since autumn. He did all of it without asking for credit, without mentioning it at dinner, without expecting a single word of thanks. Vivian noticed everything, though she pretended not to. She noticed the door no longer groaned when it opened, that the coffee no longer tasted burnt, that her wheelchair moved with a new and unfamiliar smoothness across the hardwood floors. One afternoon, unable to hold back the irritation building quietly beneath her composure, she asked him directly whether he believed himself some kind of handyman, rather than a caregiver hired to look after her. Ethan looked at her steadily and answered that if the world around her worked the way it was supposed to, she might find herself with less to be angry about. The words landed harder than he intended, and for a long moment Vivian simply stared at him, unused to being spoken to, without flattery or fear. She wheeled herself away from him that day without another word, but something in her posture had shifted. Some old defense mechanism briefly caught off guard by a man who refused to treat her like glass. Margaret noticed it too. The way Vivian lingered a little longer near the study door in the mornings. The way she no longer barked orders quite as sharply when Ethan entered the room. It was a small thing, almost invisible, but in a house that had grown accustomed to silence and ice, it felt like the first crack of a thaw no one had expected to see again. Ethan, for his part, said nothing about the changes he was noticing in her either. He had learned long ago that trust built slowly was the only kind that lasted, and he was patient in a way that unsettled people who were used to being avoided or indulged. He simply continued his quiet work through the house, one small repair after another, each one a message she never asked for and could not quite ignore. And on a cold Tuesday morning, while dusting the shelves in her private study, a task Margaret had asked him to help with, Ethan's hand paused over an old wooden picture frame, sitting half hidden behind a stack of unopened mail. The photograph inside was faded at the corners, clearly decades old, its colors softened by time into muted golds and grays. A young woman stood beside a rescue helicopter, her hair whipping sideways in what looked like a mountain wind, her smile wide and unguarded, in a way Ethan had never once seen on the face of the woman he now worked for. Beside her stood a man in a flight engineer's uniform, broad-shouldered, weathered, with a jaw Ethan recognized instantly because he had spent his entire childhood looking up into that same face across a kitchen table. His hands went still, his breath caught somewhere behind his ribs. The man in that photograph was his father. He stood frozen for a long moment, the duster forgotten in his hand, staring at a memory he had never expected to find inside a stranger's home. His father had died when Ethan was still young, a man who spent his life climbing into helicopters during blizzards and hurricanes to bring people down from places no one else would go, a man who rarely spoke about the details of his work, but carried the weight of it quietly in his shoulders every single day. Ethan had grown up believing he knew most of his father's story. He realized now, staring into that frame, that he had not known nearly enough. He turned toward the doorway just as Vivian wheeled herself into the room, and without thinking, he asked her who the man in the photograph was. The question seemed to hit her like a physical blow. Her hands moved instantly, snatching the frame from the shelf and pulling it against her chest as though protecting it from a threat only she could see. For the first time since Ethan had arrived at the estate, her composure shattered completely. Her breathing quick and uneven, her eyes wide with something that looked less like anger and more like grief that had been locked away for a very long time. She said nothing. She simply wheeled herself out of the room, leaving Ethan standing alone with a question that had clearly opened a wound neither of them had expected. That night, Ethan sat awake in his small guest room, turning the moment over and over in his mind, memory pulling him backward 20 years to a winter he had spent most of his adult life trying not to think about. His father, Daniel Calloway, had been a flight engineer for a regional mountain rescue unit, the kind of quiet hero who never once thought to call himself one. Ethan remembered the story only in fragments, pieced together from things overheard as a boy, about a terrible storm that had trapped a college student on a remote ridge outside Aspen, about a rescue that nearly failed twice before it finally succeeded, about his father missing an important flight the following week, a flight that would have secured him a promotion he had worked toward for years, because he refused to leave the search until the girl was found alive. His father rarely spoke of it afterward, except once, near the very end. In a hospital room heavy with the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a heart monitor keeping quiet, uneven time, Daniel Calloway had taken his son's hand and told him that somewhere out there was a young woman he had once pulled from the snow, a woman he never learned the name of because she had been unconscious through most of the rescue, and he asked Ethan, if he ever crossed paths with her, to tell her that he had never once regretted the promotion he lost that week. Ethan had promised. The way sons promise dying fathers, without truly believing the moment would ever come, he had carried that promise quietly for years, filed away like an old photograph in the back of a drawer, never expecting it to matter again. Now, sitting in a mansion buried in aspen snow, staring at the ceiling above his narrow guest bed, Ethan understood with a clarity that made his chest ache. Vivian Sterling was that girl. The timeline matched, the mountain matched, the storm matched. 20 years had turned a frightened college student into one of the wealthiest women in the country. But underneath the tailored blazers and the cold boardroom reputation, she was still, in some quiet, unhealed corner of herself, the girl his father had carried down a mountain in a blizzard and never forgot. He did not confront her the next morning. He waited, patient as ever, letting the silence between them settle into something less sharp before he finally asked if she would tell him about the man in the photograph, not as an employee prying into her past, but as someone who suspected he already knew the answer and needed to hear it from her anyway. Vivian studied him for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, some old wall finally beginning to lower after years of standing firm. And then, in a voice quieter than he had ever heard from her, she began to tell him what had happened on that mountain 20 years ago. She had been 21 years old, home from college for winter break, hiking a trail she had walked 100 times before, when an unexpected storm rolled in faster than any forecast had predicted. She remembered the cold most of all, a cold that stopped feeling like temperature and started feeling like something alive, something closing in around her from every direction. She remembered losing the trail, losing feeling in her hands, losing track of how long she had been walking before her legs simply gave out beneath her in the snow. And then, through the white and the wind, she remembered a shape descending from the sky, a rescue helicopter fighting through conditions no pilot should have flown in, and a man climbing down toward her with a rope and a determination that felt, even in her half-frozen memory, almost impossible. She told Ethan that the rescue itself had nearly failed twice, that the winds kept pushing the helicopter off course, that the flight engineer aboard had refused every order to abort the mission even as fuel ran dangerously low. She had been unconscious for most of it, waking only in fragments. A warm coat wrapped around her, a steady voice telling her to hold on. Just a little longer, just a little further. By the time she reached the hospital, she never learned his name. She only knew that a man had risked his career, and very nearly his life, to bring a stranger down from a mountain that should have killed her. Vivian said that in the years afterward, As her company grew and her name became something people recognized in magazines and headlines, she tried more than once to find the man who saved her. She searched hospital records, rescue unit archives, anything that might lead her back to him, but the trail always went cold, buried beneath years of turnover and lost paperwork. She never found him. She built an empire instead, poured every ounce of gratitude she could not express into her work, and kept his photograph, the one taken by a local newspaper covering the rescue, on her desk in every office she ever occupied. A quiet reminder of the debt she never got the chance to repay. Ethan listened without interrupting, and when she finished, he told her gently that the man in that photograph was his father, and that he had died 9 years earlier, still wondering, in his final days, whether the girl he pulled from that mountain had ever made it home safely. He watched something break open in Vivian's face. Not sorrow exactly, but a strange mixture of relief and grief, arriving together after 20 years of separation. She had spent 2 decades carrying gratitude she could never deliver, and now the son of the man who saved her life was standing in her study, close enough to touch, close enough to finally hear what she had wanted to say for so long. She asked, almost afraid of the answer, whether his father had suffered any consequences for missing that flight all those years ago. Ethan told her the truth, that his father had lost the promotion he had worked years to earn, that the missed opportunity had followed him quietly through the rest of his career, never spoken of with bitterness, but never entirely forgotten either. He repeated his father's final words as closely as he could remember them, that if he ever found the girl from that mountain, he should tell her that Daniel Calloway had never once regretted what it cost him. Vivian pressed a hand to her mouth, and for the first time since the accident that had taken the use of her legs, tears came freely, unguarded, entirely her own. In the days that followed, something in the house began to change in ways even Margaret struggled to explain to the rest of the staff. Vivian began asking Ethan to sit with her in the evenings, not for physical therapy or medical routine, but simply to talk, to hear stories about his father that she had never known, stories about a man who used to whittle small wooden birds for his son and hum old country songs while fixing the family truck in the driveway. In exchange, she told Ethan pieces of her own life before the accident, the relentless pace of building a company from nothing, the loneliness that came with success, the way she had never quite forgiven herself for never finding the man who saved her before it was too late. But even as the walls between them began to soften, Ethan noticed something troubling in the details Vivian shared about the helicopter crash that had left her paralyzed 2 years earlier. She described the accident almost mechanically, the way people describe things they have been told to remember, rather than things they truly recall. And certain details did not sit right in his mind. The crash had been ruled a mechanical failure, a faulty rotor blade attributed to wear and age, yet Vivian mentioned, almost in passing, that the helicopter had been serviced only weeks before the flight. Ethan, who had spent years as an aerospace engineer before shifting into caregiving work, understood machinery in a way few people around Vivian ever had, and something about the official explanation felt incomplete. He began, quietly and without telling anyone, using contacts from his old engineering days to request maintenance records that should have been part of the public investigation file. What he found unsettled him immediately. Several pages of the maintenance log appeared to have been altered after the fact, dates adjusted, signatures inconsistent with earlier records, and one particular entry regarding a replacement rotor part that did not match the manufacturer's specifications required for that model of aircraft. It was subtle, the kind of discrepancy easy to overlook unless someone knew exactly what they were looking for, but Ethan knew exactly what he was looking for, and the pattern he uncovered pointed towards something far more deliberate than mechanical failure. He brought his concerns first to Dr. Hayes, cautiously, without accusation, simply asking whether anyone had ever questioned the official cause of the crash. Hayes grew visibly uncomfortable, glancing toward the hallway before admitting quietly that Nathan Brooks, the chief operating officer of Sterling Biotech Holdings, had personally overseen the internal investigation following the accident and had discouraged further inquiry, citing the company's need to move forward without reopening old wounds. The explanation had satisfied the board at the time. It did not satisfy Ethan now. In the days before Nathan's visit, Ethan quietly cross-referenced the maintenance logs against public aviation safety filings, working late into the night after Vivian had gone to sleep, careful never to let his search show on any device connected to the estate's main network. He found that the rotor part listed in the official report did not match any part ever manufactured for that model of helicopter, a detail so specific that only someone with his background would have caught it. He printed nothing, saved nothing to anything that could be easily traced, and carried what he learned only in memory, the same way his father had once carried the weight of difficult missions without writing a word of them down. Nathan Brooks arrived at the estate 2 days later, under the guise of a routine business visit, but his eyes found Ethan almost immediately, cold and assessing in a way that confirmed every instinct Ethan had been developing. Nathan was polished in the particular way powerful men learn to be polished, his voice smooth, his handshake firm, his questions about Ethan's role in the household just probing enough to feel like more than idle curiosity. He mentioned, almost casually, that caregivers who overstep their responsibilities rarely lasted long in positions like this. A comment delivered with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Ethan said nothing in response beyond a polite nod. But he understood clearly now that his search into the crash records had not gone entirely unnoticed. That night, a storm far worse than any that had passed through Aspen that winter rolled down from the peaks, knocking out power across the entire ridge within hours. The estate plunged into darkness except for the dim emergency lighting along the hallways, and Vivian, whose motorized chair depended on a charge that was running dangerously low, found herself stranded in the east wing as temperatures inside the house began to drop. Margaret scrambled to locate emergency candles, while Dr. Hayes tried unsuccessfully to reach the backup generator company by a phone line that kept cutting in and out. Ethan moved fast, pulling on his coat and heading straight for the generator room in the basement, a space he had explored briefly during his first week at the estate while mapping out the house's mechanical systems. The generator itself was old, temperamental, exactly the kind of machine Ethan had spent years learning to coax back to life under pressure. As he worked by flashlight, hands moving quickly over wiring and fuel lines, his light caught on something tucked behind a stack of storage boxes in the corner of the room. A small external hard drive, dust-covered, clearly hidden rather than simply forgotten. Something about its placement, deliberately concealed behind boxes no one had moved in years, made him pause. He pocketed it without fully understanding why, some instinct telling him it mattered, and returned his focus to the generator until the lights across the house flickered back to life one section at a time. Later that night, once Vivian was settled and the house had quieted, Ethan connected the hard drive to his laptop in the privacy of his room, and what he found there confirmed every suspicion the altered maintenance logs had already planted in his mind. The drive contained internal company emails, financial records, and communications between Nathan Brooks and a maintenance contractor discussing the use of substandard replacement parts across several company aircraft, a cost-cutting measure implemented quietly, without board approval, in the months before Vivian's crash. One email in particular, dated weeks before the accident, referenced concerns raised by a technician about rotor integrity, concerns that had been dismissed and buried rather than addressed. Ethan barely had time to process what he had found before he heard footsteps in the hallway outside his door, deliberate and unhurried, the kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who believed they had every right to be there. He closed the laptop quickly and opened the door to find Nathan Brooks standing in the corridor, his expression carefully neutral, explaining that he had come to check on Vivian given the storm, but his eyes drifted, just briefly, to the closed laptop on the desk behind Ethan. And in that fraction of a second, both men understood exactly what the other knew. What followed was not a physical confrontation, but something far more tense. A careful dance of words in which Nathan attempted to convince Ethan that reopening the investigation would only cause Vivian unnecessary pain, that some truths were better left buried for the sake of everyone's peace. Ethan listened patiently, then told him plainly that peace built on a lie was not peace at all, and that Vivian deserved to know exactly what had happened to her, regardless of how painful that truth might be. Nathan's composure cracked for just a moment, a flash of something colder and more desperate passing behind his eyes, before he turned and left without another word, disappearing back down the darkened hallway into the storm still raging outside. The following morning, Ethan brought everything he had found directly to Vivian, sitting with her in the study where the old photograph still rested on the shelf, now returned to its rightful place in plain view rather than hidden away. He laid out the altered maintenance records, the emails detailing the substandard parts, the dismissed technician's warning, and watched her face shift from confusion to disbelief to something far heavier, something that looked almost like the floor of her entire world giving way beneath her. She had trusted Nathan Brooks for over a decade, had promoted him, defended him to the board, considered him one of the few people who had stood by her after the accident. Learning that the accident itself may have traced back to decisions he had made felt, to her, like losing something all over again. She asked Ethan, voice trembling in a way he had never heard from her before, whether he was certain, truly certain, that this was not some misunderstanding that could be explained away. Ethan told her gently that certainty was exactly why he had brought it to her, rather than confronting Nathan alone, because she deserved to see the evidence herself and decide what came next, not have the decision made for her by someone else, the way so many decisions about her life had been made without her since the accident. Something in those words seemed to steady her. And for the first time in longer than Margaret could remember, Vivian Sterling picked up the phone herself and called her legal counsel directly, her voice sharp and clear, in a way that reminded the house exactly who she had once been before the world convinced her she was only a woman in a wheelchair. The investigation that followed moved quickly once outside auditors were brought in. The same technician who had raised concerns before the crash coming forward, once he learned the company was finally listening. The truth unraveled layer by layer, revealing that Nathan Brooks had spent nearly 2 years quietly diverting maintenance budgets toward a separate financial venture of his own, cutting corners on aircraft safety to cover the gap, and when the crash occurred, he had moved fast to bury the evidence before anyone thought to look closely, positioning himself instead as Vivian's most loyal and trusted ally in the aftermath. He had planned, according to records recovered from the hidden drive, to eventually shift blame toward the pilot who had died in the crash, a man who could no longer defend himself, rather than risk his own exposure. Nathan was arrested on a gray Thursday morning, led out of the Sterling corporate offices in downtown Denver, in full view of employees who had once answered to him without question. Vivian did not attend in person, choosing instead to remain at the estate, staring out at the snow-covered mountains with an expression that held more grief than triumph. 2 years of anger she had directed at her own body, at fate, at the randomness of an accident she believed no one could have prevented, now had to be reconciled with the knowledge that someone she trusted had, through greed and carelessness, taken her ability to walk. It was a heavier truth in some ways than the lie had been. And Ethan understood that healing from it would take more than a single conversation or a single arrest. He stayed close in the weeks that followed, not pushing, not offering the kind of hollow encouragement people often reach for in moments like this, simply present in the way his father had once been present for a stranger lost in a snowstorm, steady and unwavering, without demanding anything in return. Slowly, Vivian began attending physical therapy sessions she had refused for over a year, not because a doctor insisted, but because she chose to, driven by something that felt, for the first time since the crash, like hope rather than obligation. Dr. Hayes noted quietly to Margaret one evening that he had not seen this kind of engagement from Vivian since before the accident. And both of them understood exactly what, or rather who, had brought it back. There were setbacks along the way, mornings when Vivian woke, consumed again by the anger that had defined her for 2 years, when she snapped at Margaret over nothing and refused to leave her room for days at a time. Ethan never treated these days as failures. He simply continued showing up, fixing whatever needed fixing, sitting nearby without forcing conversation, letting her know through steady presence rather than words that he was not going anywhere, regardless of which version of her greeted him that morning. Slowly, those difficult mornings grew further apart, replaced more often by days when she asked questions about the therapy exercises herself, when she pushed a little harder during sessions than her doctors recommended, impatient in a way that reminded everyone around her of the relentless woman who had once built a company from nothing. The company underwent significant changes in the months that followed Nathan's removal. New safety protocols implemented across every division that touched aviation, an independent oversight board established to prevent the kind of unchecked authority that had allowed Nathan's deception to continue as long as it did. Vivian, still working remotely from the estate, threw herself into these reforms with an intensity that reminded her senior staff of the woman who had built the company from nothing decades earlier, proof that whatever the accident had taken from her legs, it had not touched the sharp, relentless mind that had made Sterling Biotech Holdings what it was. But it was the smaller moments that mattered most to Ethan. The ones no headline would ever capture. The first time Vivian asked to be wheeled outside, simply to feel snow falling against her face, rather than watching it from behind glass. The first time she laughed, actually laughed, at something Ethan said while repairing a stubborn latch on the greenhouse door, a sound so unfamiliar in the house that Margaret dropped a tray of tea in surprise from the next room. The first time Vivian reached out and steadied her own hand against the wheelchair's rail to adjust her position without asking for help, a small act of independence that meant more to her than any board meeting she had ever chaired. Ethan never pushed her toward these moments. He simply made space for them, fixing the things around her that made independence possible, offering steady presence rather than pity, treating her not as a fragile thing to be managed, but as a woman rebuilding her life on her own terms. It was, he realized one quiet evening while watching her navigate the garden path in her chair without assistance for the first time, exactly what his father had done on that mountain 20 years earlier, not carrying her to safety so much as refusing to leave until she found the strength to get there herself. Spring came late to Aspen that year, the snow lingering stubbornly on the peaks even as the valley below began to soften into green, and Vivian used the changing season as an occasion to do something she had not done in the 2 years since her accident. She organized a formal gathering at the estate, not the kind of glittering corporate event she once hosted before the crash, but something smaller, quieter, centered on gratitude rather than business. She invited former colleagues of Daniel Calloway from the old Mountain Rescue Unit, aging men who remembered him fondly, along with representatives from local aviation safety organizations, and stood, for the first time in front of an audience since the accident, to speak publicly about the man who had saved her life 2 decades earlier. She told the story fully for the first time. The storm, the mountain, the helicopter fighting through winds no aircraft should have flown in, the man who refused every order to abort the mission until she was safely aboard. She spoke of losing track of him for 20 years, of the photograph she had kept on every desk she ever worked at, never knowing that his son would one day walk into her life, carrying the same quiet steadiness that had once pulled her from the snow. Her voice did not break, though several people in the room found themselves wiping away tears. And when she finished, she announced the creation of a new scholarship fund in Daniel Calloway's name, dedicated to training the next generation of mountain rescue engineers, funded permanently through Sterling Biotech Holdings. One of the older rescue unit members, a man who had flown alongside Daniel Calloway decades earlier, stood to share a memory of his own, describing a mission years before the storm that took Vivian up the mountain, when Daniel had spent 11 straight hours searching for a missing hiker, long after every other crew had turned back for the night. The old man's voice shook as he spoke, and he told the room that Daniel Calloway had never once, in all their years of service together, asked for recognition for anything he did, that he simply believed some other family somewhere deserved to keep the person they loved, and that belief alone had guided every decision he ever made in the field. Vivian listened with her hands folded tightly in her lap, and Ethan, standing near the back of the room, felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since the day his father passed away, without ever learning whether the girl on the mountain had survived to build a life of her own. After the ceremony, once the guests had gone and the house had quieted into evening, Vivian asked Ethan to join her in the study one final time. She wheeled herself to the shelf where the old photograph still sat, and beside it now rested a small wooden box she had kept locked away for years, one she had never shown to anyone at the estate. Inside was a worn leather watch, its face scratched from decades of use, its strap softened with age, an item that had been recovered from the mountain rescue site all those years ago, and returned to hospital staff along with her belongings, though she had never known, until now, that it belonged to the man who saved her. She placed it gently in Ethan's hands, telling him that it was time it returned to the family it had always belonged to. Ethan turned the watch over slowly, recognizing it instantly from photographs his mother had kept of his father in his younger years, before the scratches and the wear, before the mountain had claimed a piece of it just as it had claimed pieces of both their lives in different ways. He said nothing for a long moment, simply holding it, feeling something settle inside his chest that had been unsettled since the day he first saw that old photograph tucked away on Vivian's shelf. Vivian watched him quietly, then said something she had been holding on to for weeks, that there were winters that seemed as though they would never end, seasons of cold so deep and so relentless that a person began to believe warmth itself was a story from another life. But given enough time and enough patience, even the harshest winter eventually gave way, the ice cracking slowly at first and then, all at once, revealing ground beneath it that had been waiting, quietly, to grow again. She told him that she had spent 2 years believing her own winter would never end, until a man walked into her house one snowy morning and began, without asking permission, fixing everything around her that had been broken. Ethan looked at her then, really looked, past the wheelchair and the scars and the years of practiced coldness she had built to survive a world that no longer made sense to her, and saw instead the same steadiness his father must have seen in a frightened 21-year-old on a mountain 20 years ago, a strength that had never truly disappeared, only waited, buried beneath grief and fear, for someone patient enough to help uncover it again. He did not need to say much in return. He simply nodded, slipped the watch into his pocket, and told her that his father would have been glad to know she had found her way back. In the weeks that followed, the estate itself seemed to change in small, undeniable ways. Windows that had stayed shuttered through 2 long winters were open to let in the mountain air. The kitchen, once quiet and utilitarian, filled more often with the smell of something cooking, Margaret humming softly to herself as she worked, no longer bracing for the next outburst from upstairs. Dr. Hayes visited less frequently, not because Vivian needed him less, but because her recovery had settled into a rhythm that no longer required constant supervision. Each appointment now, a marker of progress, rather than crisis management. Ethan remained, not out of obligation, not because a contract demanded it, but because something between them had grown into a partnership neither of them had expected when he first walked through the front doors carrying nothing but a leather bag and a housekeeper's warning that he would not last a week. He had lasted far longer than a week. He had stayed through a blizzard, through a betrayal, through the slow and difficult work of watching a woman rebuild herself piece by piece, and somewhere along the way, the space between caregiver and patient had dissolved into something neither of them had a name for yet, though both of them understood exactly what it was becoming. On a clear afternoon in early spring, with the last patches of snow melting slowly along the tree line, Ethan wheeled Vivian out into the estate's garden, the same garden that had sat frozen and untouched for 2 winters, while she remained locked away inside her private wing. The paths had been cleared, new growth pushing up stubbornly through soil that had spent months buried beneath ice. And Vivian tilted her face toward the sun in a way that made Margaret, watching quietly from the kitchen window, finally allow herself to believe that the woman she had cared for through the darkest years of her life had truly, finally, begun to come home to herself again. They stopped near the old stone fountain at the center of the garden, dry and silent through the winter months, but now, thanks to repairs Ethan had made weeks earlier, beginning to trickle water again for the first time in years. Vivian reached out and touched the cool stone edge, watching the water catch the afternoon light, and told Ethan quietly that she had not felt this steady, this certain of her own footing, since long before the accident that took her legs, perhaps not since long before the mountain that had first brought his father into her life. Ethan said nothing, only stood beside her chair, watching the same water she watched, content in a silence that no longer felt heavy the way silences once had inside these walls. Margaret, watching from a distance with a tray of tea she had not yet worked up the courage to interrupt, thought back to the morning she had warned Ethan he would not last a single week under this roof, and found herself laughing quietly to no one at how wrong she had been about nearly everything. She had seen caregivers come and go for 2 years, each one more cautious than the last, each one treating Vivian as something to be managed rather than someone to be known. And she understood now, watching the two of them by the fountain, that the difference had never been about skill or patience alone. It had been about a promise carried across 20 years, by a man who never once knew whether he would get the chance to keep it, and a woman who had waited, without realizing it, for exactly that kind of steadiness to return to her life. The story of Vivian Sterling and Ethan Calloway never made headlines the way her corporate battles once had, because what happened between them was never meant for headlines at all. It belonged instead to quiet mornings and small repairs, to a photograph that had waited 20 years to be understood, to a promise made in a hospital room that finally, after so long, found its way home. What began as an impossible assignment, a woman no caregiver could survive working for, and a man determined to try anyway, became instead a story about two people bound together across 2 decades by an act of courage. Neither of them had witnessed themselves, but both of them carried forward, each in their own way, until the day their paths finally crossed on a snow-covered mountain in Aspen, Colorado, and neither of their lives was ever quite the same again.